Is this a project? Or an insult? Annie tried to keep her voice calm. She stood near the end of the long conference table, holding a dark blue folder with the Whitmore Global logo printed in silver across the front. The folder looked official, important, like every other folder in the room. Except hers was empty. She looked at the other interns. Their folders were open in front of them, filled with printed instructions, department notes, deadlines, charts, and supervisor assignments. Then she looked back at her own folder, hoping she had missed something. But there was only one blank sheet of paper inside. Everyone else was assigned a project, Annie said, forcing her voice not to shake. They have instructions, departments, supervisors, and clear deadlines, but I only received an empty folder. Richard Collins slowly closed the document in front of him. He was the manager in charge of the internship program, the man who decided which interns stayed and which ones went home before they ever had the chance to prove themselves. He looked up at Annie as if she had interrupted something sacred. "Miss Carter," he said, "is there a problem?" Annie raised the folder slightly. "Yes, sir. There's nothing in here. Just one blank sheet of paper." The room went quiet. A few interns stopped writing. Someone's pen froze against the table. 2 seats away, Brandon Collins lowered his eyes to his own folder, but not quickly enough. Annie had already seen the bold title printed across his first page. Northline Project. Her breath caught. That was the project she had been waiting for. More than that, it was the project the official email had said was assigned to her. Richard stood and walked slowly around the table. When he reached Annie, he held out his hand. "Let me see it." Annie handed him the folder. Richard opened it, glanced inside, and lifted the single blank page between 2 fingers. He stared at it for a moment before giving a small, unpleasant laugh. "Well," he said, turning the folder back toward her, "weren't you the one everyone was praising last week?" Annie said nothing. Richard looked around the room, making sure everyone was listening. The girl who corrected the quarterly cost model. The girl Mrs. Parker called sharp. The girl who finished the practice report before lunch. His eyes returned to Annie. "That was you, wasn't it?" Annie's face grew warm, but she kept her shoulders straight. "I completed the work I was given, sir." "Exactly." Richard slipped the blank sheet back into the folder. "So why panic now?" "I'm not panicking," Annie said. "I'm asking which project I'm supposed to complete." Richard stepped closer. His voice dropped just enough to sound private, but everyone in the room could still hear him. "Aren't you supposed to be smart?" he asked. "One empty folder, and now you're ready to give up?" Annie's fingers tightened at her sides. Richard pushed the folder back toward her. "This is the project I assigned you." Annie looked at the folder, then at him. "My project is an empty folder?" "This project," Richard said, his voice hardening, "is meant to prove whether you can handle pressure without someone holding your hand. The others weren't given that kind of test. The others are not your concern." Brandon lowered his head again. His folder was still open. Annie could see enough to know the truth. Maps, spreadsheets, printed instructions, and a supervisor assignment. It was not a pressure test. It was a real project, a valuable one, a project that could decide the future of an intern. Richard pressed the folder closer to Annie's chest. "Take it." Annie took it. The folder was so light it almost felt weightless, but in her hands, it felt heavier than a threat. Richard turned back to the room. "Every intern must complete and submit the assigned project by 5 o'clock on Friday. No exceptions. No excuses. Anyone who fails to submit on time will be removed from the program." Annie stared at him. "How am I supposed to complete a project with no instructions?" Richard smiled, but there was no kindness in it. "Miss Carter, if you can't figure that out, perhaps this office was never the right place for you." Annie wanted to argue, but she saw the trap clearly. If she reacted, she would be called unprofessional. If she stayed silent, she would be eliminated. So she held the folder against her chest and sat down. The meeting continued as if nothing had happened, but Annie barely heard another word. She kept staring at the folder in front of her. Along the inside edge of the cover, near where the project label should have been, she noticed a faint strip of dried glue. Something had been attached there once, then removed in a hurry. When she tilted the folder toward the light, she thought she could see the faded outline of letters pressed into the cover. After the meeting ended, the interns gathered their things. Brandon walked toward the door with the Northline project folder tucked against his chest. Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder and whispered something that made Brandon nod. Annie waited until most of the room had emptied. Then she approached Richard. "Mr. Collins," she said, "may I speak with you for a moment?" He did not look surprised. "About what?" "My folder." Richard sighed as if she had exhausted him. "Miss Carter, I believe I made myself very clear. I can't submit something that doesn't exist." His eyes sharpened. "Careful. I'm not accusing anyone," Annie said. "I'm only asking to be given the assignment I was told I would receive. Your assignment is in your hands. It's blank. Then I suggest you become creative." The words hit Annie like a slap. "Sir, I received an email stating that I had been assigned to the Northline project." For the first time, Richard's expression changed. Only slightly. Only for a second. But Annie saw it. Then his false smile returned. "Preliminary emails are not final decisions. Was I notified of that change? You are being notified now, but Brandon has the Northline project." Richard stepped closer and lowered his voice. "My son earned that position on his own merit. I'm not saying he didn't." "No," Richard said coldly, "but I understand what you're implying." Annie took a slow breath. "What I'm saying is that my email says one thing, and this folder says another." Richard glanced toward the open door, then back at her. "You're young, Miss Carter. Let me give you some advice. In this company, people who start by questioning their superiors rarely last long." Annie said nothing. Richard leaned against the conference table. "Friday, 5 o'clock. If that folder is not completed and submitted on time, you can pack your things and go home. Do you understand?" Annie looked down at the empty folder. "Yes, sir." She left the conference room with slow steps and a tight throat. For the first few moments, she did not even know where she was going. She held the folder tightly against her chest. Not because it comforted her, but because she was afraid that if she let go, the last piece of evidence would disappear. She turned a corner too quickly and collided with a man stepping out of the private elevator. The impact was not hard, but it knocked the folder from her hands. The blank sheet slid across the polished floor and stopped beside a pair of perfectly shined black shoes. "Watch where you're going," the man snapped. Annie froze. Then she looked up. Jonathan Whitmore stood in front of her. The founder of Whitmore Global, the man whose name was on the building directory, on the internship brochure, and on the scholarship letter her mother had taped to the refrigerator. "I'm sorry, sir," Annie said quickly, bending down. "I'm truly sorry." She dropped to one knee to pick up the paper, but her hands were shaking so badly that the corner bent. The folder lay open beside her, empty and exposed. Jonathan's irritation faded as he looked down at what she was gathering. He had expected scattered reports, loose charts, maybe meeting notes. Instead, the girl in front of him was picking up a blank sheet from an empty folder, as if it were the only thing she had left. His voice changed. "Wait." Annie stopped, still holding the paper. Jonathan looked at the folder, then at her face. His gaze did not pass over her carelessly. It stayed there, studying more than she wanted him to see. "Is this your project folder?" Annie swallowed. "Yes, sir." Jonathan looked back at the folder. "It seems a little light for a project folder." Annie tried to answer, but her throat tightened. Jonathan bent down and picked up the folder himself. He opened it, checked both pockets, then looked at the single blank sheet in Annie's hand. "Who gave this to you?" Annie slowly stood. "Mr. Collins." Jonathan's face did not change, but his eyes did. "And what did he say?" Annie looked past him toward the glass wall of the conference room. Then she told him everything. She told him Brandon had been given the Northline project. She told him she had received an email saying Northline had been assigned to her. She told him Richard Collins had handed her this empty folder and said it was her project. If she failed to submit it by 5 o'clock on Friday, she would be removed from the program. Jonathan listened without interrupting. When Annie finished, he looked at the folder again. He noticed the faint glue mark along the cover, then looked back at the young woman standing before him, trying to stay composed while fear sat plainly in her eyes. "Do you still have that email?" "Yes, sir. I printed it." "Good." He handed the folder back to her. "Bring it." "Sir?" "Come with me." Annie blinked once, then followed. Jonathan did not walk fast, but everyone in the hallway moved aside before they even understood what was happening. At the end of the hall, he stopped outside Richard Collins's office. The door was not fully closed. Through the narrow gap, Annie heard Richard's voice. "No, Brandon, calm down," Richard said, sounding pleased with himself. "I told you that girl is finished. By Friday, she'll have nothing to submit. and I'll remove her from the program myself." Annie held her breath. Jonathan raised one hand, warning her not to speak. Inside the office, Richard laughed. "Let's see how smart she really is. Let's see her analyze an empty folder." His chair creaked. Through the crack in the door, Annie saw him leaning back with one leg resting on the opposite chair. His polished shoe sat there as if he owned not only the office, but the future of everyone inside it. He was holding the phone to his ear, smiling up at the ceiling. "Your Northline package is safe," Richard continued. "Just focus on your presentation. Mr. Whitmore likes confidence. As for that girl, she's been praised a little too much lately. She needed a lesson." Jonathan pushed the door open. Richard turned his head, the smile still on his face, but that smile vanished before the phone even left his ear. Jonathan stepped into the office. Annie stood right behind him, holding the empty folder tightly in both hands. For one long second, no one in the room moved. Richard Collins was the first to react. He lowered the phone from his ear, his thumb quickly tapping the screen to end the call, then sprang to his feet so fast that the chair behind him rolled sharply backward. The easy smile he had worn only seconds earlier vanished. In its place appeared a strained smile, the kind a man had practiced too many times in front of a mirror. "Mr. Whitmore," Richard said, smoothing his tie with one hand. "What an unexpected honor. If I had known you were stopping by today, I would have had the quarterly internship report ready for you." Jonathan Whitmore did not answer right away. He stood in the doorway. Annie stood just behind him, clutching the empty folder against her chest with both hands. Richard's office was larger than most of the offices on that floor. A fine leather chair sat slightly angled beside the desk, the same chair Richard had been resting his feet on only minutes before. Richard noticed Jonathan's eyes flick toward that chair. The smile on his face grew even tighter. "I was just speaking with my son," Richard explained quickly. "You know how young people are these days. Their first major corporate program, they get nervous, excited. I was only giving the boy a little encouragement." Jonathan stepped into the room. It sounded like more than encouragement. Richard let out a soft laugh. "Oh, I'm sure the hallway echo made it sound different. These doors are terrible with sound. I've already reported it to facilities." He turned to Annie, his expression suddenly almost gentle. "And as for Miss Carter here, I think she's a little emotional. I understand. The first day of receiving an assignment can feel overwhelming." Annie's hands tightened around the folder. Jonathan looked straight at Richard. "She says you gave her an empty project file." Richard nodded slowly, as if he had expected the accusation and was sorry things had come to this. "Yes, I suppose I can see how it might be interpreted that way." He gestured toward the chairs. "Please, both of you, have a seat. There's no need to make this tense." Jonathan did not sit. Neither did Annie. Richard's smile disappeared for a brief moment, then quickly returned. "All right, standing is fine." He moved around the desk, more carefully this time. "Mr. Whitmore, with your permission, I'd like to explain the context. Miss Carter is a very intelligent young woman. Truly intelligent. No one denies that. In fact, I've been one of her strongest supporters." Annie stared at him. Richard turned to her as though they were simply clearing up a small misunderstanding. "Haven't I spoken very highly of you, Miss Carter? Haven't I told the entire team that you have potential?" "You said I was talented," Annie replied. "Then you handed me a blank folder." Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly, as if he had been wounded. "That's not fair." Jonathan spoke. "Let her finish." Richard's smile froze. "Of course." Annie swallowed. "Everyone else received a complete set of materials. Brandon received Project Northline. I received one blank sheet of paper." Richard spread his hands. "And that, Mr. Whitmore, was exactly the purpose of the exercise." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Exercise?" "Yes, a preparation exercise. We've used similar variations before, although perhaps not in this exact form." Richard turned fully toward Jonathan, his voice smooth and polished, like a man giving a presentation to a boardroom. "The internship program is not only about technical ability. It is also about initiative, adaptability, and the ability to solve problems under uncertainty. In real business, clients don't always provide complete instructions. The market doesn't simply place a finished package in your hands. Sometimes you begin with very little and build from there." Jonathan looked down at the folder. "So you gave her nothing." "I created ambiguity for her." Annie felt her face grow hot. Richard seemed to notice, so he lowered his voice, making it softer. "Miss Carter, I understand why that made you uncomfortable. I truly do. But discomfort is not discrimination. Pressure is not punishment. Sometimes pressure is how we find out who is truly ready. Jonathan took another step toward the desk. So every intern received this preparation exercise? Richard paused. Not every intern needs the same development path. That wasn't an answer. Richard nodded, as if accepting a reasonable correction. No, not everyone received it. Miss Carter's profile suggested she might benefit from a challenge outside the usual structured guidance. Annie looked at him. My profile? Yes. You're quick. Perhaps quick enough to rely too much on being the smartest person in the room. The words were spoken lightly, but the blade hidden inside them was sharp. Jonathan heard it. Careful. Richard immediately raised both hands. I meant no offense. I'm complimenting her. Sincerely, she's exceptional. That's why I raised the standard. Richard's eyes flicked very quickly toward the desk phone. Brandon was assigned according to the needs of the program. Decided by whom? This department handles that. By you? Richard gave another small laugh. Ultimately, yes, but through the normal review process. Annie opened her bag. I received an email saying Project Northline had been assigned to me. Richard's expression did not change, but his jaw tightened. Sometimes preliminary emails are generated before final decisions are made. Annie took out the sheet of paper and handed it to Jonathan. He accepted it, read it, and placed it on the desk. Richard looked at the email as though it were a minor inconvenience rather than evidence. Jonathan said, Here it is. Her name, Project Northline. Your electronic signature. Richard nodded. Yes. And again, I understand how it looks. How does it look? Annie asked softly. Richard turned to her with a look of patience mixed with disappointment. Miss Carter, in a company this large, early notifications happen all the time. Assignments can also change. That's not unusual. I should have communicated the change more clearly. I take responsibility for that part. If you felt anxious because of a communication issue, I apologize. The apology sounded so smooth it was almost perfect. Jonathan said, She isn't complaining about communication. She is complaining that she was threatened with termination for failing to complete a project you never gave her. Richard's smile slowly disappeared. I simply reminded all the interns about the deadline. You told her to pack her things and go home. Richard looked at Annie. Is that what you heard? That is exactly what you said. Miss Carter, sometimes young professionals mistake firmness for hostility. I was setting expectations. Jonathan's voice lowered. Don't turn this into a question of her hearing. Richard went silent. Annie lifted the empty folder in front of her. You handed me this in front of everyone. You told the group that anyone who failed would be removed. Then, in your office, you said that if I couldn't complete it, I could pack my things and go home. That wasn't a test. It was a trap. If Annie's courage moved you, please like this video. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about truth, justice, and the strength to stand up when it matters most. Richard's face hardened, then softened again as soon as he remembered Jonathan was watching. I'm sorry you feel that way. My feelings didn't make those documents disappear. Jonathan looked at Richard. Where are the original documents from her folder? Richard blinked. I don't know that there ever were documents in it. Then why is there glue residue where the project label was peeled off? Richard glanced at the folder. Folders are reused from time to time. For senior management internship assignments, administrative staff prepare those materials. Labels can be moved. By staff? Usually. Not by you? Richard smiled again, but this time there was no warmth left in it. Mr. Whitmore, I don't personally assemble every folder. Jonathan said nothing. He let the silence settle over the room, and in that silence, for the first time, Richard Collins no longer looked like a man in control. Then he said, Mrs. Parker. Annie turned. Evelyn Parker stood at the open doorway, tablet in hand, as if she had arrived exactly when needed. She looked from Jonathan to Richard, then to Annie's folder. Yes, sir? Please pull the conference room camera from this morning. Richard's face changed before his words did. His smile stayed in place, but something behind it slipped. Jonathan, he said quickly, almost warmly, surely that isn't necessary. I've already admitted the communication could have been better. Let me fix it internally. No need to involve security over a training exercise. Jonathan did not look away. If it was a training exercise, the footage will help you. Richard's smile froze. Mrs. Parker waited. Jonathan said, "Now, please." "Yes, sir." As Mrs. Parker stepped inside, Annie moved aside to make room for her. The older woman gave her a brief look, not pity, not surprise, something steadier. Recognition. It was the look of a woman who had worked long enough in polished offices to know when a young person was being cornered. Richard reached for the coffee cup on his desk, then seemed to change his mind. "Mr. Whitmore, may I speak with you privately?" "No. With respect, this concerns department procedure. It concerns Annie's project. She stays." Richard pressed his lips together. "Of course." Mrs. Parker placed the tablet on the desk and entered her security credentials. The office was quiet except for the faint tapping of her fingers. Annie could hear the building vents moving air through the ceiling. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear Richard shifting his weight, trying to decide whether to keep smiling. Jonathan stood beside the desk, calm, hands at his sides. He did not rush Mrs. Parker. Men like Richard often survived by making people hurry, by pushing them into nervous explanations, by turning confusion into surrender. Jonathan seemed to understand that. He let the silence work. Richard tried one last time. "You know how these things can look in the wrong light," he said. His voice lowered, almost confidential. "A young black intern, a strict department head, an assignment dispute. People will make it something ugly before the facts are clear. I'm trying to protect her too." Annie felt the words move through her like cold water. Protect her. He had given her nothing, threatened her job, laughed about removing her from the program, and now he wanted to stand in front of the truth, wearing concern like a clean shirt. Jonathan turned his head slowly. "Do not use protection as another word for silence." Richard stopped talking. Mrs. Parker tapped the screen. "I have the footage." Jonathan looked at Annie, then at the empty folder in her hands. "Play it." The first image appeared on the tablet. Then Mrs. Parker sent it to the office monitor on Richard's wall. The conference room filled the screen from a ceiling corner angle. The picture was clear enough to see the long table, the interns taking their seats, the stack of folders near Richard's hand. Annie watched herself enter the room. She looked smaller on camera. Careful. She sat near the end of the table and placed her notebook in front of her. She remembered that moment. She had been nervous, but hopeful. She had believed that after all the tests, interviews, early mornings, and late-night studying, her work had finally carried her into the right room. On the screen, Richard began handing out folders. One intern received a thick packet. Then another. Then another. Annie saw people opening binders, reading instructions, smiling in relief when they found their names printed clearly on the first page. Brandon received his packet next. Richard paused before handing it over. It was quick, but visible. He glanced down at two folders, then turned his body slightly, using the table to block the view from the interns. But the camera sat above him, not beside him. Mrs. Parker zoomed in without being asked. The room seemed to stop breathing. On the screen, Richard opened a folder with a white label on the front. The label was not fully readable at first, but when he tilted it, the words appeared for less than a second. Annie Carter Project Northline. Annie's fingers tightened around the real empty folder in her hands. Richard removed a thick set of papers from that folder. He slid them into another folder. Then he closed the first one, now nearly flat, and placed it into the stack near Annie's side of the table. The other folder, the one now filled with Annie's project materials, went to Brandon. No one in the office spoke. The monitor kept playing. Annie watched Richard call her name, watched herself stand, watched him hand her the folder with a small smile, watched herself return to her seat and open it. Even though she already knew what happened, seeing it from above made her stomach turn. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not pressure training. It was not a communication gap. It was a hand reaching into her future and removing the work before she could touch it. Richard exhaled sharply. That angle is misleading. Jonathan did not look at him. The angle shows your hands. It doesn't show intent. The phone call did. Richard's face hardened. You heard one side of a conversation taken out of context. Jonathan finally turned to him. Then give me the context. Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Mrs. Parker paused the footage at the frame where Richard's hand held the Northline packet halfway between Annie's folder and Brandon's. The image sat on the screen like a signature. Annie looked at Richard. You told me I was the problem. Richard avoided her eyes. Miss Carter, this is more complicated than you understand. No, she said quietly. It's simple. You gave him my project. The words were soft, but they changed the room. Annie felt it. Mrs. Parker felt it. Even Richard felt it, because he flinched as if she had spoken louder. Jonathan said, Mrs. Parker, save this footage. Send a copy to legal and to my secure file. Yes, sir. And pull the hallway footage outside this office for the last half hour. Richard's head snapped up. Why? Jonathan's voice stayed even. Because I heard you laughing through a door, Richard. I'd like the record to hear it, too. Richard stepped away from the desk. This is unnecessary. No, what was unnecessary was handing her an empty folder. Mrs. Parker worked silently. Annie watched the monitor switch to the hallway view. There they were. Jonathan and Annie outside Richard's door. The sound was not clear at first. Only muffled tones. Then Mrs. Parker adjusted the audio. Richard's voice came through the speakers. No, Brandon, relax. I told you, she's done. By Friday, she'll have nothing to turn in, and I'll remove her from the program myself. Annie looked down. She had heard it once. Hearing it again made it worse, because now there was no shock to protect her. Then came the laugh. Ho, ho, ho. Let her be smart now. Let's see her analyze an empty folder. Richard stood motionless. Jonathan watched the screen to the end. He did not interrupt it. He did not soften it. He let Richard's own voice finish the job. When the clip ended, the office felt smaller than before. Mrs. Parker lowered the tablet. Saved and sent, sir. Jonathan nodded. Thank you. Richard's voice came out dry. Jonathan, we have known each other for years. We have worked in the same building for years, Jonathan said. That is not the same thing. Richard looked toward Annie then, and for the first time there was fear in his face. Not regret. Fear. Annie, he said, changing his tone. Perhaps we both let the morning get away from us. I may have been too hard on you. She stared at him. I can assign you another project, he continued. A good one. Something clean. Something fair. We can put this behind us before it becomes a stain on your record. My record? Annie asked. Richard realized the mistake too late. Jonathan picked up the empty folder from Annie's hands and placed it on Richard's desk. This is the record, he said. Then he looked at Mrs. Parker. Call human resources. Call legal. And have security preserve every project assignment file from this internship cycle. Mrs. Parker nodded once. Right away. Richard's face drained. Security? Yes, Jonathan said, because we are no longer discussing a training exercise. We are discussing falsified assignments, retaliation, and a department head who tried to set up an intern to fail. Annie stood still, but inside her something shifted. The shame Richard had tried to hand her began to loosen, not disappear. Things like that did not disappear in one morning, but it no longer belonged to her alone. Jonathan turned to her. Do you have any other documents? Annie thought of the printed email, the note in her bag, the copy she had made because her mother told her paper remembered. Yes, sir. Good. Keep them with you. Richard looked from Jonathan to Annie. You're making a mistake. Jonathan did not blink. No, Richard. You made it. We're just done pretending it was hers. Jonathan did not wait for Richard to answer. He turned toward the door, and the room moved with him. Mrs. Parker stepped into the hallway to make the calls. Annie followed with the empty folder pressed against her side and the printed email folded inside her notebook. Behind her, Richard remained near his desk, suddenly smaller in an office built to make him look important. Mr. Whitmore, Richard called after them. A moment, please. Jonathan stopped but did not turn around. Richard lowered his voice, the way men did when they wanted a threat to sound like advice. You know how fast stories spread inside a company. An investigation like this could embarrass the entire internship program. It could embarrass you. Now Jonathan looked back. That program is not embarrassed by the truth. It is embarrassed by people who think interns are disposable. Annie saw Richard's eyes flick toward her. He wanted to say something else. He wanted to remind her that he still had power, still had friends, still knew how to write a report that could make her sound difficult. But Jonathan was standing there, and the old rules had shifted. Mrs. Parker returned. Human Resources is waiting in Conference Room B. Legal is joining in person. Security is preserving the footage now. Good, Jonathan said. Annie, stay with me. Yes, sir. They walked down the hall together. A few employees looked up from their desks, then quickly looked away. Annie knew that kind of looking. Not cruel, not kind, just hungry for information. By lunchtime, some version of this would be moving through the floor. In every office, news had its own feet. Jonathan seemed to sense what she was thinking. You don't owe anyone an explanation in the hallway. Annie nodded, though her throat remained tight. Conference room B was smaller than the assignment room, with a round table, a wall monitor, and a pitcher of water no one touched. 2 HR managers were already inside. One was a woman named Carol Benson, with short gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck. The other, a younger man in a navy suit, stood when Jonathan entered. A woman from legal arrived seconds later, carrying a laptop and a yellow notepad. Richard came in last. He had fixed his tie. He had fixed his face, too. The fear had been put away behind a manager's calm. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Richard said, as if he had called the meeting himself. Jonathan sat down. Do not chair this meeting. Richard's smile paused. Carol Benson looked from Jonathan to Annie. Mr. Whitmore, we understand there's a concern involving an intern assignment. There is more than a concern, Jonathan said. There is video, an email, and a recorded hallway statement. The legal counsel, a woman named Dana Ellis, opened her laptop. Let's proceed carefully. Miss Carter, are you comfortable being present? Before Annie could answer, Richard leaned forward. That is exactly my concern. She may feel pressured. She's already upset. Perhaps it would be better if HR spoke with her privately. Annie looked at him. There it was again, wrapped in concern. Remove her from the room. Speak for her. Turn her into the subject instead of the witness. Jonathan said, Annie decides. Everyone looked at her. For a second, she felt the old pull to shrink. Her mother's voice came back to her, steady from a small kitchen table in a small apartment. Don't let them make you look guilty for asking what already belongs to you. I'll stay, Annie said. Carol nodded. All right. Jonathan placed the empty folder on the table. It made almost no sound. Then he placed the printed email beside it. This is what Miss Carter received this morning, he said, touching the folder. This is what she received 3 days ago. He touched the email. They do not match. Dana leaned forward and read the email. Project Northline. Assigned to Annie Carter. Digital authorization by Richard Collins. Richard cleared his throat. Preliminary notice. Not a final assignment. Carol looked at him over her glasses. Was there a revised notice? It appears there was a delay in communication. That means no? Richard's mouth tightened. Not formally. No. Dana made a note. Was Miss Carter informed verbally before the assignment meeting? Richard glanced at Annie. The program often requires flexibility. That is not an answer, Dana said. No, Richard replied. Annie kept her hands in her lap under the table so no one could see them tremble. Jonathan looked to Mrs. Parker, who had taken a seat near the monitor. Show them. The conference room footage played first. The same scene appeared again, but this time in front of people whose job was to name consequences. Annie watched herself receive the folder again. She watched Richard transfer the documents again. The second viewing did not hurt less. It only made the wound more precise. Carol's expression changed before the video ended. The younger HR manager sat back slowly. Dana stopped typing. Richard spoke as soon as the clip paused. That angle lacks context. I was reorganizing packets. There were last-minute changes. Dana looked up. Why were last-minute changes made after an authorized email? Manager discretion. Documented where? Richard blinked. In the assignment system. Jonathan said, then open it. The room turned to Richard. He adjusted his cuffs. I don't have my laptop with me. Mrs. Parker placed a company laptop on the table. You can sign in here. Richard stared at the laptop for a moment too long. Carol said, Mr. Collins? Of course. He took the laptop and typed. The first password failed. He smiled thinly. Sorry. Long morning. The second worked. Mrs. Parker connected the screen. Richard navigated the system with careful fingers. Annie watched the folders and tabs appear, each one with names, dates, approval marks, and status notes. It looked so ordinary. That was what frightened her. Harm did not always look dramatic. Sometimes it sat inside neat software with drop-down menus. Richard opened the Project Northline assignment file. The first screen showed Brandon Collins as current assignee. Dana said, "History." Richard hesitated. Jonathan said nothing. He did not need to. Richard clicked the History tab. There it was. Original assignee, Annie Carter. Changed to Brandon Collins. Changed by Richard Collins. Time, 10:47 p.m. Reason, manager discretion. Carol leaned closer. Why was the change made at 10:47 last night? Richard's answer came too quickly. Because I was reviewing Final Fit. Final Fit? Annie said before she could stop herself. Richard looked at her. Yes, some projects require a certain presentation style. Jonathan's eyes hardened. Say clearly what you mean. Richard lifted both hands. I mean, Brandon has more polish. He has been around these environments longer. Northline may be technical, but it will be reviewed by senior people. Clients may eventually see the model. Annie felt the old familiar meaning beneath the clean words. Polish, fit, presentation, words people used when they wanted to judge a person without admitting what they were judging. Carol did not miss it either. Her face grew still. Dana asked, was Miss Carter's technical score lower than Brandon Collins's? Richard looked at the screen. Scores are only one part of the evaluation. Was it lower? No. Carol asked, was it equal? Richard breathed in. No. Dana leaned in. Then was it higher? Richard did not answer. Mrs. Parker reached across and clicked the evaluation tab before anyone stopped her. The rankings appeared. Annie Carter, highest technical score. Brandon Collins, 7th. No one spoke. Annie stared at the screen. But the numbers blurred. She had known she did well. She had not known she ranked first. Richard had known. That was why the folder had been emptied. Not because she was unready, because she was ready enough to be dangerous to his plan. Jonathan's voice broke the silence. Read the evaluator note. Mrs. Parker clicked. Recommended for Project Northline lead track. Strong analytical judgment. Clear written presentation. Executive review potential. Carol closed her eyes briefly, the way older people sometimes did when disappointment confirmed something they had hoped not to see. Richard tried again. A high score does not guarantee leadership placement. No, Dana said. But it raises the question of why the top-ranked intern received no project at all. Richard looked toward Jonathan. I intended to give her a separate challenge. With no documentation? Jonathan asked. It was informal. With a termination threat attached? Richard had no good answer left, so he reached for the only one weak men often chose. I may have handled the delivery poorly. Annie looked at the empty folder on the table. Poorly. That word was too small. Poorly was forgetting a name. Poorly was sending the wrong calendar invite. This had been a plan. A quiet one. A clean one. A plan that would have ended with her being marked incomplete while everyone else moved on. She raised her eyes. If Mr. Whitmore hadn't been in the hallway, what would my record say on Friday? Carol looked at Annie, then at Richard. Richard did not answer. Dana did. Based on the deadline policy, if no submission was received, the system would mark the project incomplete. And then? Annie asked. The younger HR manager shifted uncomfortably. The intern could be subject to removal. Annie nodded once, not because she was satisfied, but because the truth had finally been spoken by someone else. Jonathan stood. Preserve the assignment history. Preserve the email records. Preserve the footage. No one touches Project Northline until this is reviewed. Richard rose too. Jonathan, you are overreacting. Jonathan turned to him. No, I am late. The room went quiet. He looked at Annie then, and his voice softened without losing weight. Miss Carter, you will not be removed from this program. You will not be marked incomplete, and no one in this building is to discuss your status without HR, legal, and my office present. Carol nodded. Understood. Richard stared at the table. For the first time since Annie had entered Whitmore Global Group, the rules were being spoken in a language she could trust. Jonathan picked up the empty folder and slid it gently back toward her. Keep this, he said. Richard looked up. Why would she keep that? Jonathan did not look at him. Because it proves what you gave her. Richard stared at the folder as if it had insulted him. Annie picked it up from the table. She expected her hands to shake again, but they did not. The folder was still empty. The blank sheet was still inside. Nothing about the object had changed, yet everything around it had. An hour earlier, Richard had used it to make her look unprepared. Now Jonathan had placed it back in her hands like a receipt. Carol Benson removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Until this review is complete, Mr. Collins, you are not to contact Miss Carter directly." Richard's head turned. "That is unnecessary." "It is necessary," Dana Ellis said, closing her laptop halfway. "Any communication goes through HR." Richard gave a careful laugh. "So I'm being treated like I committed a crime because of a folder?" Jonathan looked at him. "You are being treated like a manager who gave an intern nothing, threatened her record, reassigned her project to his son, and then lied about it." The words stayed in the air. Richard's face hardened. "I have served this company for 11 years. And today," Jonathan said, "we are looking at what you did with that trust." Annie kept her eyes on the table. She did not want to look at Richard, not because she was afraid of him now, but because she knew if she saw his anger, she might remember too clearly how it had felt to stand alone in that assignment room. She wanted to keep breathing normally. She wanted to stay useful to herself. Carol turned toward Annie. "Miss Carter, would you be willing to give us a written statement?" "Yes, ma'am. Today, if possible." "Yes, ma'am." Dana's voice was gentler. "Include what happened in the assignment room, what Mr. Collins said afterward, and what you heard outside his office. Keep it factual. No need to make it sound legal. Just tell it as it happened." Annie nodded. Richard pushed his chair back. "This is absurd. She's already being coached." Jonathan stood before anyone else could answer. Meeting paused. "Legal will send instructions. Carol, please arrange a room for Miss Carter to write her statement." Carol gathered her papers. "Of course." Richard stepped toward the door at the same time Annie did. Jonathan's hand moved slightly, not touching Annie, just indicating she should go first. It was a small courtesy. Her mother would have noticed it. Annie did too. In the hallway, the office sounded different. Phones rang. Printers hummed. Someone laughed near the break area, then lowered their voice when they saw Jonathan. Annie wondered how many people already knew. Maybe they had seen Mrs. Parker moving fast with her tablet. Maybe they had seen Richard walk into HR with his mouth tight. Maybe they knew nothing and were only reacting to the presence of power. Carol led Annie to a small interview room near Human Resources. It had a round table, 2 chairs, a box of tissues, and a window that looked into another conference room with the blinds half closed. Someone had left a yellow legal pad on the table. "Would you like water?" Carol asked. "Yes, please." Carol brought her a paper cup from the hallway cooler. "Take your time." Annie almost smiled at that. Time was exactly what Richard had tried to take from her. A deadline without a project. A failure scheduled in advance. When Carol left, Annie sat alone. She placed the empty folder on the table, opened her notebook, and unfolded the email. The paper had softened along the creases. Her mother's words came back to her again, not loud, just present. "When people can change their words, keep paper." She began writing. At 9 a.m., all interns were called into the assignment room. Mr. Collins stood at the front with project folders. Each intern received a folder containing a project packet. When I received mine, it contained only 1 blank page. She stopped. The sentence looked too plain for the humiliation it carried, but Dana had said to keep it factual, and facts did not need decoration to be heavy. She continued. "When I asked about it, Mr. Collins said this was the project he assigned. He said if I could not complete it by Friday at 5 p.m., I could pack my things and go home." Annie's pen paused over the word home. For Richard, home had been a threat. For Annie, home was her mother sitting at the kitchen table in an old robe after a night shift, asking if she had eaten. Home was a pot of grits on Saturday mornings, church shoes lined neatly by the door, and bills stacked under a magnet on the refrigerator. Home was not failure, but Richard had said it as if being sent back there would prove she never belonged in the building at all. She wrote the rest. Outside the door, voices moved past. "Is she in there?" someone whispered. Another voice answered, "I don't know. HR said don't talk about it." Annie kept writing. After 20 minutes, Mrs. Parker knocked once and opened the door just enough to look in. "How are you holding up?" Annie looked at the page. "I'm writing it down." "That's good." Mrs. Parker stepped inside and closed the door behind her. In her hand was a small paper bag from the cafe downstairs. I thought you might not have eaten. Annie stared at the bag. Thank you, ma'am. It's just a turkey sandwich. Mustard on the side. I guessed. That's fine. Thank you. Mrs. Parker sat across from her but did not crowd the table. I've worked for Mr. Whitmore a long time. He can be stern, but he does not like bullies. Annie gave a small nod. Mrs. Parker's eyes moved to the empty folder. Did you notice the label mark yourself? Yes, ma'am. Good eye. I didn't know if it mattered. People who do wrong count on small things not mattering. Annie looked up. Mrs. Parker's voice stayed even. When I was your age, I worked in a bank in Queens. A supervisor used to change the cash drawer assignments. When shortages showed up, always put the errors under the same teller. Young Puerto Rican girl, quiet, needed the job. Everyone said she was careless until she kept her own notes. She tapped the table once with her finger. Notes saved her. What happened to the supervisor? Transferred first, fired later. They always get one soft landing before the truth catches up. Annie absorbed that. Older people, she had learned, sometimes carried whole histories in 1 or 2 sentences. Mrs. Parker stood. Finish your statement. Don't make it pretty. Make it accurate. After she left, Annie ate half the sandwich because her hands needed something ordinary to do. Then she finished the statement and signed her name at the bottom. By early afternoon, Carol returned with Dana. They reviewed Annie's statement in front of her, not over her head. Dana asked a few questions. Did Mr. Collins ever tell you before today that your assignment had changed? No, Mum. Did he ever say the empty folder was a formal pressure exercise before Mr. Whitmore confronted him? No, Mum. Did he offer you a written rubric for that exercise? No, Mum. Carol wrote something down. Were you aware that Brandon Collins had been assigned Project Northline before the meeting? No. I only knew I had received the email saying it was mine. Dana nodded. That helps. Annie almost laughed. It doesn't feel helpful. No, Dana said. But it is. A knock came at the door. Jonathan entered without the usual force of a man interrupting people. He paused first. May I come in? The question surprised Annie. He owned the building, or enough of it that people acted like he did. Still, he asked. Yes, sir, she said. He came in and closed the door. Richard has been placed on temporary administrative restriction pending review. He is not terminated yet. That requires process. But he no longer has authority over you or Project Northline. Annie felt something loosen in her shoulders. Jonathan continued. Brandon's packet has been collected. He has been instructed not to discuss the matter with you. Is he in trouble? That depends on what he knew and when he knew it. Annie nodded. She did not like Brandon, but she did not want to become Richard. She did not want to enjoy someone else's fear. Jonathan noticed that too. You are allowed to be angry, Annie. I know. But, she looked at the empty folder. I don't want anger making decisions for me. For the first time that day, Jonathan's face softened. That is something many adults never learn. Carol cleared her throat gently. We'll need to review the full assignment archive. If this happened once, we have to make sure it didn't happen before. Richard's office flashed in Annie's mind. His confidence, his practiced explanations, his quick phrases about polish and fit. People did not become that smooth on their first lie. Jonathan looked at Dana. How far back can we pull records? 3 internship cycles immediately. More if IT has backups. Pull all of it. Dana nodded. I'll request system access. Jonathan turned back to Annie. For now, you will be given a temporary workspace away from Richard's department. You will not be expected to submit anything by Friday. Annie should have felt relief. Instead, a new worry rose. What about Project Northline? We are reviewing it. She sat straighter. Sir, I don't want it taken away because of what he did. Jonathan studied her. You still want the project? Yes, sir. After all this? It was mine before all this. The room went quiet. Carol glanced down, hiding a small smile. Mrs. Parker, standing near the doorway now, did not hide hers. Jonathan nodded once. Fair enough. He reached for the empty folder, but Annie's hand moved first, not grabbing, just resting lightly on the cover. Jonathan stopped. Annie looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. No, he said. Keep it. Dana closed her notebook. We'll make copies of the documents. The original folder can remain with Miss Carter for now, unless legal needs custody later. Annie picked it up and held it closer. Outside the interview room, the office continued around them. Elevators opened and closed. Someone rolled a cart of mail past HR. The ordinary world did not stop for injustice, and it did not stop for truth either. It simply made room when people forced it to. Jonathan opened the door, then paused. Annie. Yes, sir. You were right to ask the first question. She knew which question he meant. Is this a project or an insult? Annie looked at the blank folder, then at the printed email resting beside her statement. I didn't mean to say it out loud, she admitted. Jonathan's voice was quiet. Most important questions are spoken before we feel ready. Then he left. Annie stayed seated for a moment longer. The folder lay in her lap now, still empty. But it no longer felt like a dead end. It felt like the first page of a record Richard Collins had never expected anyone to read. Annie remained in the interview room after Jonathan left, listening to the faint sounds of the office beyond the door. She had expected someone to come in and tell her what to do next, but for several minutes no one did. That quiet felt strange. Since morning, everything had happened too fast. The assignment room, Richard's warning, Jonathan at the elevator, the camera footage, the HR meeting. Now the room gave her space, and space made her thoughts louder. She looked down at the empty folder in her lap. The Silver Company logo caught the light from the ceiling. It looked official, clean, harmless. That bothered her most. The thing Richard had used to trap her did not look cruel. It looked like paperwork. Her phone buzzed inside her bag. Mom. Annie stared at the screen for 2 rings before answering. Hi, Mama. Martha Carter did not waste time with small talk. Baby, are you all right? You texted me 1 sentence and then disappeared. Annie had forgotten the text. After Richard's office, while waiting outside HR, she had typed, Something happened. I'm okay. I'll call soon. I'm okay, Annie said. That is what people say when they are trying not to scare their mothers. Annie closed her eyes. For the first time that day, her voice almost broke. He gave me an empty folder. Silence came through the line. Then Martha said, Start from the beginning. So Annie did. She told her mother about the assignment room. Richard holding the folder in front of everyone, his words about packing her things and going home, the email, Jonathan, the open office door, the phone call, the laugh, and the camera. She tried to keep it simple, but some parts came out tangled. Martha listened without interrupting until Annie finished. Then she said, Did you keep the email? Yes, ma'am. The folder? In my lap. Good. Annie gave a small, tired laugh. That's what Mr. Whitmore said too. Then that man has some sense. Annie leaned back in the chair. Mama. He laughed about it. Mr. Collins. He laughed like it was nothing. I know. You don't know. You weren't there. No, Martha said softly. But I know the sound of people enjoying power they didn't earn. Annie looked toward the closed door. HR is reviewing everything. Mr. Whitmore said Richard can't supervise me now. That is good. I still feel sick. That is also normal. Annie pressed her fingers against the folder. Part of me feels like I did something wrong by making it bigger. Martha's voice changed, not louder, but firmer. Listen to me. You did not make it bigger. He made it bigger when he decided your work belonged to his son. You only stopped carrying it alone. Annie said nothing. Martha continued, and don't you let them buy your silence with politeness. Some people will smile at you now because the camera caught what their conscience missed. That sentence settled deep. A knock came at the door. Annie wiped quickly under one eye, though no tear had fallen. Mama, someone's here. You call me when you leave. And eat something real, not just coffee. Yes, ma'am. I mean it. I know. When Annie ended the call, Carol Benson stepped in with Dana Ellis behind her. Carol carried a thin folder of her own, pale gray, labeled temporary work assignment. Miss Carter, Carol said, we're moving you to a workspace near Mrs. Parker's office for the remainder of the day. You won't report to Mr. Collins or anyone in his chain. Annie stood. All right. Dana placed a hand on the back of a chair. We also need to ask you something before we proceed. Did Mr. Collins ever make comments about you being praised? About Brandon being compared to you? Annie remembered the conference room. Weren't you the one everyone kept praising last week? Yes, she said. Today, in front of everyone. He said people kept praising me. And then he asked if one empty folder was enough to make me quit. Carol's mouth tightened. Anything before today? Annie thought back. Last week, after Mrs. Parker said my cost summary was clear, Mr. Collins told me not to get too comfortable. He said corporate offices are not school competitions. Dana wrote it down. Anyone present? 2 interns. Maybe Brandon. I'm not sure. Namis? Annie gave what she remembered. She hated how small the details sounded once spoken. A sentence here, a look there, a warning dressed like advice. But small things had built the morning. Carol seemed to understand. These patterns matter. As they stepped into the hallway, Annie felt people looking again. Not everyone. Just enough. A man near the copier stopped mid-conversation. 2 interns at the far end turned away too quickly. Annie held the empty folder at her side instead of hiding it. She was tired of carrying proof like contraband. Mrs. Parker's office sat near Jonathan's suite, behind a quieter set of glass doors. Her desk was neat but lived in. A framed photo of 2 grandchildren, a mug from Niagara Falls, a small dish of peppermints, and a stack of messages written in careful handwriting. She opened a small side office for Annie. You can work here for now, Mrs. Parker said. No one will bother you. Annie stepped inside. The room had a desk, a chair, a phone, and a view of the neighboring building's brick wall. It was not much, but it had a door. Thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Parker pointed to a tray. There's paper if you need notes. Printer is down the hall. Bathroom is to the left. If anyone asks you questions, send them to me. Annie nodded. Mrs. Parker paused at the doorway. You did well in there. I didn't feel like it. That is often how doing well feels. After she left, Annie sat at the desk and took out her notebook. She expected to wait. Instead, she opened a blank page and wrote Project Northline at the top. Then she stopped, staring at the words. It was still hers, not officially returned yet, not fully cleared, but hers in the way truth was hers before anyone approved it. 10 minutes later, the side office phone rang. Annie hesitated, then answered. This is Annie Carter. For a second, no one spoke. Then Brandon's voice came through. It's me. Her spine stiffened. You're not supposed to call me. I know. I'm sorry. I just Annie. I didn't know he emptied your folder. She looked toward the glass door. Mrs. Parker was at her desk, reading something on her monitor. Brandon, you need to call HR. I will. I already talked to them. I told them he said Northline got switched. I thought maybe you got something else. I got nothing. I know that now. Annie closed her eyes briefly. Why are you calling? He exhaled into the phone. Because when I saw your face in the conference room, I knew something was wrong, and I still didn't say anything. That was honest enough to hurt. Annie did not answer. Brandon continued, quieter. My dad told me not to worry about it. He said you were making noise because you didn't like pressure. Did you believe him? I wanted to. Annie looked at the empty folder on the desk. That's not the same as believing. No, Brandon said. It's worse. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Annie said, don't call me again unless HR is on the line. Okay. And Brandon? Yeah? Don't defend what you know is wrong just because it came from your father. The line went quiet. I won't, he said. Annie hung up and sat still. She did not feel sorry for him. Not exactly. But she understood that Richard had damaged more than one person that morning. He had taken Annie's project, but he had also handed his son something poisoned and called it opportunity. At Mrs. Parker's desk, the phone rang. She listened, then looked toward Annie's office. Annie, she called gently. Annie stepped out. Mrs. Parker covered the receiver. Legal found something in the system history. Mr. Whitmore wants you in the review room. Annie picked up the empty folder. Mrs. Parker glanced at it. Still taking that? Yes, ma'am. Good. They walked together toward the review room. The hallway seemed longer this time, less like a path through a company and more like a line drawn between what had been hidden and what was about to surface. Annie did not know what legal had found, but she knew one thing now with a certainty she had not had that morning. Richard had not acted like a man making his first mistake. He had acted like a man following a habit. Mrs. Parker walked half a step ahead of Annie, not rushing her but not slowing down either. The empty folder stayed, tucked under Annie's arm. People looked up as they passed, then lowered their eyes to keyboards, phones, and paper cups. By now, something had moved through the office. Annie could feel it. A workplace had a way of changing temperature before anyone admitted there was a fire. The review room sat behind two glass doors near the legal department. Jonathan stood at the far end of the table with Dana Ellis beside him. Carol Benson was there too, along with an IT security manager Annie had never met. A narrow man with tired eyes and a badge clipped crookedly to his jacket. Jonathan looked up when Annie entered. "Thank you for coming back." Annie nodded. "Mrs. Parker said you found something." Dana gestured to a chair. "Sit if you'd like." Annie stayed standing. "I'm okay." Jonathan did not push her. "This may not only be about today." The sentence landed hard, though Annie had expected it. Richard had sounded too practiced, too ready with soft explanations. A person did not learn to disguise a trap in one morning. The IT manager turned the monitor toward them. "My name is Paul Reynolds. I manage access logs for internal systems. Legal asked me to pull the assignment history for the current internship cycle. When I did, I saw archived changes from prior cycles tied to the same administrator account." "Richard's account?" Annie asked. Paul looked at Jonathan before answering. "Yes." Dana clicked the first file open. A spreadsheet appeared with names, dates, project titles, original assignments, revised assignments, and notes. Annie saw rows highlighted in pale yellow. Carol leaned forward. "How many?" "Current year, including Miss Carter, 3 questionable changes," Paul said. "Last year, 2. Year before, 4. We're still pulling older backups." Annie stared at the screen. 3, 2, 4. Numbers clean enough to fit in a spreadsheet, but each one had been someone's summer, someone's chance, someone's mother waiting for good news. Jonathan's voice stayed controlled. "Define questionable." Paul swallowed. "High-scoring interns reassigned away from executive-facing projects after initial approval. In each case, the project went to an intern with a lower technical ranking. In most cases, the revised reason was manager discretion, polish, or client readiness." Annie heard that word again, Polish. It had a way of sounding harmless until it was used to close a door. Dana opened another tab. "We also found note fields not visible on the standard HR dashboard. They were stored in the administrative revision log." Richard's hidden comments appeared on the monitor. "Too quiet for client exposure. Lacks executive presence. Better suited for support. Not Northline material. Do not let her outshine, Brandon." Annie read the last line twice even though she had already heard it in another form. She felt no surprise now. Surprise required some hope that the explanation would be better. Carol removed her glasses and set them on the table. "Were these notes part of the official evaluation process?" Paul shook his head. "No, they were personal administrator notes, not shared with review panels." "Can they be altered?" Dana asked. "Yes, but the archived logs preserve earlier versions. These are server-side backups." Jonathan looked toward Annie. "Do you recognize any of the names?" Annie stepped closer to the monitor. She scanned the list. Some names meant nothing to her. Then she stopped. "Malik Johnson," she said. "He spoke at orientation. He was a returning intern last summer, right?" Carol nodded slowly. "He left before final presentations. I remember someone saying he had family issues." Dana glanced at Paul. "Open his file." Paul clicked. Malik Johnson had been assigned to an executive analytics project, then moved to inventory support 4 days later. His technical score ranked second in his cohort. The note beside his reassignment read, "Strong numbers, weak client image." Annie's stomach tightened. Mrs. Parker, standing near the wall, spoke for the first time. "I remember Malik. He used to come in early and read the Wall Street Journal in the break room because he said he wanted to learn the language of the building." No one answered. The detail made him too real. Carol looked at the screen. "Why was he marked voluntary withdrawal?" Paul clicked again. "There's an email from Richard to HR. It says Malik failed to engage with his assigned track and chose not to continue." Dana said, "Do we have Malik's resignation email?" Paul searched. "No, Only Richard's summary. Jonathan's jaw moved once. Find him. Dana nodded. We will. Annie looked at another highlighted name, Sofia Alvarez. I met her during the welcome breakfast. She told me she was the first in her family to work in a corporate office. Her file showed a similar pattern. Assigned to market strategy. Reassigned to clerical support. Note. Limited polish. May struggle with senior room dynamics. Carol's voice was low. She received a poor final evaluation. From Richard, Jonathan asked. Yes. Annie felt the folder under her arm press against her ribs. It no longer felt like only her evidence. It felt like the corner of something larger that had been buried under polite language. Richard had not simply wanted Brandon to win. He had learned how to decide who belonged in the front of the room and who should be grateful to stand near the wall. Dana closed the file, then opened another set of records. There is one more issue. Jonathan looked at her. Brandon Collins was assigned upward twice before this cycle, 2 prior training rotations. In both cases, another intern was originally ranked above him. Carol's eyes narrowed. So, this was not the first time Richard adjusted placement for his son. Paul said, the logs suggest no. Annie thought of Brandon's voice on the phone. I wanted to believe him. She wondered how many things Brandon had accepted without asking where they came from. Jonathan walked to the window and looked out at the city. For several seconds, he said nothing. Annie watched his reflection in the glass. He did not look like a man surprised by wrongdoing. He looked like a man measuring how long it had been allowed to stand near his name. When he turned back, his voice was quieter. This program carries the Whitmore Foundation seal. Dana nodded. Yes. My signature is on the annual letter. Yes. He looked at the files again. Then every intern who was pushed aside under this system was turned away under my name. No one tried to soften it. Annie respected that. Carol folded her hands. We need to put Richard on formal suspension pending investigation. Do it, Jonathan said. Dana added, we also need to restrict his system access immediately. Paul was already typing. I can disable it now. Now, Jonathan said. Paul worked in silence. After a few clicks, he said, access suspended. Mrs. Parker's phone buzzed. She checked the screen and looked at Jonathan. Richard is asking to leave for the day. He says he feels unwell. Jonathan gave a short nod. Security can escort him to collect his personal items. No files. No laptop. No phone downloads. Mrs. Parker typed the instruction. Annie looked down. Part of her thought she should feel relief. Instead, she felt tired in a way sleep would not fix. There was a special kind of exhaustion that came from learning the trap under your feet had caught others before you. Jonathan noticed. Annie, you don't need to stay for the rest of this. She looked up. I want to. You may hear things that are difficult. I already did. Carol gave her a look that held both concern and respect. Then you can stay as a witness, not as someone responsible for fixing it. That mattered. Annie nodded. Yes, ma'am. Dana turned back to the screen. Next step is preserving communications. Richard's emails, project assignment edits, messages related to Brandon, and any notes containing terms like polish, client image, executive presence, and support track. Add all interns reassigned after initial approval, Jonathan said. Not just those terms. Paul nodded. Mrs. Parker's phone buzzed again. This time her mouth tightened. What is it? Jonathan asked. Richard wants to speak with you before he leaves. No. He says if this becomes formal, he'll retain counsel and claim retaliation. Dana's expression did not change. He can retain counsel. That is his right. Jonathan looked at Mrs. Parker. Tell security to proceed. Annie heard shouting faintly from beyond the glass doors a minute later. Not words, just a raised male voice swallowed by office walls. People looked up again. Mrs. Parker stepped out, and the noise died down. When she returned, she said, he's leaving. Jonathan nodded once, but his attention had already returned to the monitor. Dana opened the final file. This is the current Northline packet, the full version Brandon received. Annie saw the title page. Project Northline, Operational Cost Reduction, and Distribution Analysis. There were charts, data access instructions, project goals, and a presentation schedule. It was everything she had expected, everything that had been taken from her hands before she ever saw it. Jonathan looked at Annie. Do you still want this project? The question was not casual. Everyone in the room understood that saying yes meant stepping back into work tied to humiliation, investigation, and office gossip. Annie looked at the screen, then at the empty folder under her arm. "Yes, sir." "Why?" "Because Mr. Collins didn't take it because I couldn't do it. He took it because he was afraid I could." The room went quiet. Jonathan looked at Carol. "Prepare a new assignment packet for Annie. Full access. New deadline. New supervisor. Not connected to Richard's department." Carol nodded. "I'll handle it." Dana said, "We should wait until the formal review." Jonathan lifted one hand. "The review can continue. Her opportunity does not need to remain frozen while we investigate the man who tried to steal it." Dana considered that, then nodded. "Agreed, with documentation." "Document everything," Jonathan said. Annie stood still, holding the empty folder. It seemed strange to think that in the same day she had been threatened with removal and restored to the project she had earned. But restored was not the same as healed. She knew that now. Mrs. Parker came beside her. "I'll make sure the packet is printed properly this time." Annie almost smiled. "Thank you, ma'am." "And Annie?" "Yes?" Mrs. Parker looked at the empty folder. "Don't throw that away." "I won't." Jonathan heard her answer and nodded once, as if approving more than a filing decision. Outside the review room, Richard Collins was being escorted past the glass doors with a security officer beside him. He carried no briefcase now, only his coat over one arm. His face turned toward the room, and for a moment his eyes met Annie's. This time, he did not smile. Annie did not look away. Richard passed the glass doors with security beside him, and the office watched without admitting it. Heads lifted over cubicle walls, then lowered. A few people pretended to study monitors. One man near the copier held the same page in his hand for nearly a minute. Annie stood inside the review room, the empty folder tucked under her arm, and saw Richard look at her through the glass. This time he did not smile. For a second, she thought he might stop. He did not. Security walked him toward the elevator, and Mrs. Parker stepped into the hallway to make sure no one followed too closely. Richard's coat hung over his arm. His briefcase stayed behind. That detail mattered. Men like Richard carried authority in leather bags, in access cards, in closed-door conversations. Now he carried only a coat. When the elevator doors closed on him, the floor did not burst into noise. It became quieter. Jonathan turned away from the glass. "Carol, how soon can Annie have a proper Northline packet?" Carol checked her notes. "Within the hour. I'll have IT grant access and assign a new supervisor." "Who?" Carol thought for a moment. "Marcus Reed. Operations strategy. He's thorough, fair, and he doesn't report to Richard." Jonathan nodded. "Good." Dana lifted one finger. "We should document that the assignment is being restored based on original ranking and prior authorization, not as a special accommodation." Annie looked at her. Dana met her eyes. "That protects you." Annie nodded. "Thank you." Paul from IT was still at the monitor, opening tabs and saving logs. "I'll need Miss Carter's employee ID to restore the Northline data room access." Annie gave it to him. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. As Paul typed, Carol looked over at her. "Annie, I know this has been a difficult morning. We can arrange for you to go home for the rest of the day with pay. It won't affect your standing." Annie almost said yes. Her body wanted a bus ride, a locked apartment door, her mother's voice in the kitchen. But then she looked at the Northline title still glowing on the monitor. If she went home now, even with permission, she knew some people would say she could not handle the pressure. Richard had planted that story already. She would not water it for him. "I'd like to stay," she said. Carol studied her for a moment. "You don't have to prove anything today." "I know, ma'am. But I don't want my first real work on Northline to start tomorrow because of him." Jonathan's expression changed just a little. "Respect, maybe. Or regret." "Then you'll stay," he said, "but not alone." Half an hour later, Annie sat in the small side office near Mrs. Parker's desk. The empty folder lay to her left. A new folder lay to her right. This one was full. Carol had brought it herself, not through an assistant. She placed it on the desk and waited while Annie opened it. Inside were printed instructions, a project summary, access credentials, performance expectations, a revised timeline, and a cover sheet with Annie's name spelled correctly. Project Northline assigned to Annie Carter. Beneath the title were 3 signatures: Carol Benson from HR, Marcus Reed from Operations Strategy, and Jonathan Whitmore. Annie touched the corner of the page but did not pick it up right away. Carol noticed. "Would you like a minute?" "No, ma'am, I'm just reading it." "You'll have 10 business days from today. No one expects you to compress the work Richard tried to steal into the old deadline." Annie looked up. "Thank you." Carol leaned slightly against the door frame. "I've been in HR for 29 years. I've seen people make a mistake, and I've seen people build a system that lets their mistake look normal. We are still figuring out which one this is." Annie glanced at the empty folder. "I think he knew exactly what he was doing." "I think so too," Carol said, "but I can't write that until the record proves it." Annie understood. Her mother always said grown folks in offices needed proof for what poor people recognized on site. Carol left her to read. The Northline packet was detailed. It asked for a review of regional distribution costs, vendor delays, warehouse routing, and fuel surcharges across company operations in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Ohio. Annie read the first section twice. The work was hard, but it was not impossible. That made her angrier than the empty folder had. Richard had not protected the company from an unprepared intern. He had protected his son from comparison. A soft knock came at the open door. Marcus Reed stood there with a legal pad in one hand and a ceramic mug in the other. He was in his late 50s, tall, with a tired but steady face. His shirt sleeves were rolled once at the wrist, and his tie had been loosened like a man who cared more about the work than the show. "Annie Carter?" "Yes, sir." "Marcus Reed. I'll be your project supervisor, assuming you're willing to work with me." She stood quickly. "Yes, sir." He waved her back down. "Don't jump up on my account. I've got knees older than some departments in this building." Annie sat, surprised into a small smile. Marcus pulled the extra chair closer but did not sit until she nodded. "I read the short version. I don't need you to retell it unless you want to." "I don't." "Fair." He set his legal pad on the desk. "Then let's talk about the work. Northline is messy, not glamorous. You'll spend more time with spreadsheets than with people. That is usually where the truth hides." Annie glanced at the old folder. "I'm starting to learn that." Marcus followed her eyes. "That the one?" "Yes, sir. Keep it where you can see it, but don't let it do the work for you." She looked at him. He explained. "Anger can wake you up. It can't build the model. The numbers still need discipline." Annie nodded slowly. "My mother said something like that. Smart woman." "She is." Marcus opened the packet. "All right. First task. Read the data dictionary. Not the charts, not the summary, not the executive overview. The dictionary. Half the errors in this company come from people graphing numbers they don't understand." That sounded so ordinary, so practical, that Annie felt her feet touch the ground again. For the next 40 minutes, they reviewed the first pages. Marcus showed her where prior reports had glossed over vendor delays, how fuel surcharges were grouped under the wrong cost center, and why Northline mattered. He did not speak to her like she was fragile. He did not speak like she owed him gratitude. He spoke like she was there to work. When he left, he said, "Email me 3 questions by 4 o'clock, not 10. 3. Good questions beat long lists." "Yes, sir. And eat lunch if you haven't." "Mrs. Parker gave me a sandwich." Then Mrs. Parker remains the only person keeping this company alive. From outside, Mrs. Parker called. "I heard that." Marcus smiled. "I intended you to." After he left, Annie read the data dictionary. The office noise returned to its usual rhythm. Keyboards. Phones. Elevator chimes. Somewhere, someone microwaved soup and the smell drifted briefly through the floor. It reminded Annie that people could have terrible mornings inside ordinary days. At 3:52, she sent Marcus 3 questions. Not perfect questions, but real ones. One about delayed vendor reporting. One about fuel cost allocation. One about why a warehouse in eastern Pennsylvania appeared twice under different routing codes. 3 minutes later, Marcus replied, "Good eye. Start with the duplicate routing code tomorrow. That may be something." Annie read the message twice. "Good eye." The words were simple. They did not erase the morning, but they gave the afternoon a place to stand. Near 5, Jonathan stopped by the side office. He did not enter until she looked up. "How is the project?" "Complicated," Annie said. "That usually means worth doing." She nodded toward the new folder. "Mr. Reed said the truth hides in spreadsheets." Jonathan gave a quiet laugh. "Marcus has been saying that for 20 years. Annoyingly. He's often right." Annie hesitated. "Sir?" "Yes. Why did you believe me?" Jonathan looked at the empty folder on the desk before answering. "I didn't begin by believing everyone. I began by not dismissing you." That answer stayed with her. He continued, "There's a difference. Powerful people often demand trust before they offer fairness. That is backward." Annie looked down at her notes. "I thought if I asked too many questions, I'd lose everything. You nearly lost everything because someone hoped you wouldn't ask one." The hallway outside had begun to thin as employees left for the day. Coats came off chairbacks. Laptops closed. Weekend plans and dinner reservations floated past the door. Jonathan tapped the edge of the new packet once. "Go home soon. Work will still be here tomorrow." Annie almost said she wanted to stay longer, but her mother's voice rose in her mind. "Eat something real. Call me when you leave." "Yes, sir." When Jonathan left, Annie packed slowly. She put the full Northline packet into her bag first. Then she picked up the empty folder. For a moment, she considered leaving it in the desk drawer. Instead, she slid it beside the real packet. One folder held the work, the other held the warning. As she walked toward the elevators, fewer people stared. Or maybe she cared less. Mrs. Parker called after her. "Good night, Annie." Annie turned. "Good night, Mrs. Parker. Thank you for today." Mrs. Parker gave her a look over her glasses. "Come back tomorrow ready to work. That will thank me enough." The elevator doors opened. Annie stepped inside holding both folders close. Downstairs, beyond the lobby glass, New York evening moved in headlights and tired footsteps. Her phone buzzed. "Mom," Annie answered before the second ring. "I'm leaving now," she said. Martha exhaled. "You still standing?" Annie looked at her reflection in the elevator doors, the full folder against her bag, the empty one tucked beside it. "Yes, ma'am," she said, "and I've got work to do." Annie stepped out of the elevator into the lobby with her mother still on the phone. The glass doors at the front of the building reflected the early evening traffic along 6th Avenue. People moved past in coats and work shoes, carrying laptop bags, takeout containers, and the tired faces of those who had given their best hours to someone else's clock. Annie held the phone with one hand and kept the two folders pressed against her side with the other. "I'm taking the train," she told her mother. "You eat yet?" "Mrs. Parker gave me a sandwich." "That is not dinner." "I know, Mama." "No, you know I know. That's different." Annie almost smiled. "I'll eat when I get home." Martha was quiet for a second. "You sound better." "I don't know if I am. Better doesn't always mean happy. Sometimes it just means you're still standing straight." Annie looked down at the folders. "Mr. Whitmore gave me the project back." "The real one?" "Yes, ma'am. Project Northline." "And that man who tried to take it?" "He's suspended. They're investigating." Martha let out a slow breath. "Good." The word was small, but Annie could hear everything inside it. Relief, anger, caution, and the old knowledge that one day's justice did not erase a lifetime of watching people dodge it. "I'll call when I'm on the train," Annie said. "You keep both hands free on that platform." "Yes, ma'am. And don't let your phone battery die." "Yes, ma'am." "And Annie?" "Yes?" "You did right today." Annie stopped near the revolving doors. Outside, a delivery cyclist cut between taxis. A man in a Yankees cap held the door for a woman with grocery bags. The city looked rough and ordinary, and alive. "I was scared," Annie said. Doing right while scared still counts. After the call ended, Annie stood in the lobby for a moment before walking out. The evening air was warm from pavement and exhaust. Her stomach was hollow, but her mind would not rest. She kept seeing Richard's hand moving documents from one folder to another. She kept hearing his laugh. Ho, ho, ho. Let her analyze an empty folder. At the subway station, she found a place near a pillar and held her bag in front of her the way her mother had taught her. The Northline packet was inside, thick with work. The empty folder sat beside it like a shadow. On the train, Annie stood for 2 stops before an older black man in a brown jacket motioned to the seat beside him. "Sit down, young lady. You look like you've been arguing with a whole building." Annie blinked. then sat. "Thank you, sir." He nodded at the folder sticking out of her bag. "School? Work. Same thing some days." She gave a small laugh despite herself. He returned to his newspaper. But before he did, he said, "Don't let them wear you out before you get where you're going." The train rocked forward. Annie looked at her reflection in the dark window. She wondered how many strangers in the city carried advice like loose change, handing it to the next young person who looked like they needed fare. When she reached home, the apartment smelled of onions, pepper, and warm cornbread. Martha Carter stood at the stove in her house shoes, stirring a pot with one hand and holding her lower back with the other. She had changed out of her work uniform but still looked tired in the shoulders. Annie set her bag on a chair. "Mama, you didn't have to cook." Martha turned. "I did have to. You had a day. I was going to make something. You were going to stare into the refrigerator like the answer was in there." Annie smiled for real this time. Dinner was chicken and rice, green beans, and cornbread from a cast-iron skillet Martha said had belonged to Annie's grandmother. They ate at the small kitchen table, the same table where Annie had printed the email 3 days earlier. The scholarship letter from Whitmore Global still hung on the refrigerator beneath a magnet shaped like a peach. Martha listened as Annie told the story again, slower this time. When Annie reached the part about Richard saying she could pack her things and go home, her mother put her fork down. "He said that to your face?" "Yes, ma'am." "And then tried to say he was protecting you?" "Yes." Martha shook her head. "Some folks will push you toward the road and call it guidance." Annie looked at the 2 folders on the chair beside her. "Mr. Whitmore asked why I still wanted the project." "What did you say?" "I said Mr. Collins didn't take it because I couldn't do it. He took it because he was afraid I could." Martha stared at her for a second. Then she reached across the table and squeezed Annie's hand. "That's my girl." After dinner, Annie washed the plates while Martha dried them. It was their old rhythm. Soap, rinse, towel, stack. The simple work helped. It gave her hands a job that had nothing to do with proving herself. Later, at the kitchen table, Annie opened the Northline packet. Martha poured sweet tea into 2 glasses and sat across from her, though her eyes were tired. "You don't have to sit up with me," Annie said. "I know. You worked all day. So did you." Annie read the first pages again. Marcus Reed had told her to start with the data dictionary, so she did. It was full of terms that sounded dry but mattered. Vendor delay codes, regional surcharge classifications, routing duplication, warehouse transfer variants. She wrote 3 notes in the margin, then stopped on the duplicate routing issue Marcus had flagged. Eastern Pennsylvania appeared twice under different codes. One route charged fuel surcharges through a third-party carrier. The other charged the same region under direct distribution. If both were active, the company might be paying twice for part of the same route. She frowned. Martha noticed. "That face means something." "I don't know yet." "Then write it down before it runs off." Annie wrote, "Possible duplicate route billing. Check vendor IDs." For the first time all day, the work pulled her forward more than the insult pulled her back. Near 10, Martha stood and stretched. "I'm going to bed. Don't you sit here till sunrise trying to win the whole war tonight." "I won't." Martha pointed at her. That was too quick. Annie lowered her eyes to the packet. "I'll stop at 11. 10:30. Mama, 10:45 and that is Grace." "Yes, ma'am." Before leaving, Martha touched the empty folder lying beside the full packet. "You keeping this on the table?" "For now." "Good. Let it remind you, but don't let it feed on you." Annie looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means injustice can give you fuel, but it can also eat your sleep, your joy, and your good sense. Use it. Don't worship it." Martha kissed the top of her head and went to bed. Annie sat alone in the kitchen after that, listening to pipes knock softly in the wall and cars passing outside. The apartment was not quiet the way the office had been quiet. This was a lived-in quiet. A safe one. She opened her laptop and logged into the data room with the credentials Paul had restored. The system accepted her password. For a moment, she simply stared at the access screen. "Welcome, Annie Carter. Project Northline Data Room." Her name was there, not Brandon's, not blank. Hers. She clicked into the vendor files and searched for the Pennsylvania routing codes. The duplicate appeared again, then another inconsistency. A fuel surcharge tied to a warehouse transfer that should not have had one. She wrote it down. Then a delayed reporting flag connected to the same vendor. By 10:43, She had 3 questions for Marcus and 2 new leads for herself. At 10:45, her phone alarm chimed. Martha had set it years ago during exam season and never let Annie delete it. The label read, "Rest is part of the work." Annie smiled. She closed the laptop, but before putting the folders away, she opened the empty one. The blank sheet lay inside, still clean, still useless, for any project Richard had pretended to assign. Annie took a pen and wrote the date in the corner, not to change the evidence, not to make it pretty, to remember the day it stopped being just empty. Then she placed it beside the full Northline packet on the kitchen table. One had carried the lie, the other carried the work. Between them sat her notebook, open to the first real question she would ask tomorrow. Possible duplicate route billing. Annie turned off the kitchen light and went to bed knowing 2 things at once. Richard Collins had tried to send her home with nothing, and somehow, home had helped her find where to begin. Annie woke before the alarm. For a few seconds, she did not remember why her chest felt heavy. Then the day came back in pieces. Richard's laugh, Jonathan's voice, the conference room footage, the new Northline packet on the kitchen table. She lay still and listened to the apartment. Pipes knocked softly in the wall. A bus sighed at the curb outside. From the bedroom across the hall, her mother coughed once and went quiet again. Annie got up carefully so the old floorboards would not complain. In the kitchen, she found Martha had left a note beside the coffee maker. "Eat something. Pride is not breakfast." Under the note sat a covered plate with 2 boiled eggs, toast wrapped in foil, and an apple cut into slices because Martha still treated fruit like proof of love. Annie smiled, ate standing at the counter, then packed both folders into her bag. The empty one went behind the full Northline packet. She did not know why the order mattered, only that it did. On the train, she reviewed her notes. Possible duplicate route billing. Check vendor IDs. Compare Pennsylvania warehouse transfer codes. The work gave her something solid to hold. Around her, commuters rocked with the movement of the car, reading phones, closing their eyes, balancing coffee and paper cups. Nobody knew that a girl in a navy coat was carrying evidence in one folder and a second chance in another. At Whitmore Global, the lobby guard looked at her badge, then at her face. "Morning, Miss Carter." He had not called her by name before. "Good morning," she said. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. When the doors opened on the executive floor, conversation dipped in a way people hoped she would not notice. Annie noticed anyway. A woman near the reception desk gave her a small nod. One intern stared too long, then looked down at his phone. Someone whispered from behind a cubicle wall. Annie kept walking. Mrs. Parker was already at her desk with a cup of tea and a stack of message slips. She looked over her glasses. "You came back." Annie paused. "Was I not supposed to? I meant that as a compliment." "Oh." Annie adjusted her bag strap. "Then thank you." Mrs. Parker pointed toward the side office. "Mr. Reed asked for you at 9. Mr. Whitmore wants a brief check-in at noon. HR may request another statement later, but only if legal needs clarification." "Is Mr. Collins here?" "No." The answer was short enough to be kind. Annie stepped into the side office and placed the Northline packet on the desk. She set the empty folder beside it but did not open it. Then she logged into the data room. Her access still worked. That alone felt like a small victory. At 9 sharp, Marcus Reed appeared with a legal pad tucked under his arm and a paper cup of coffee. "Morning, Annie." "Good morning, Mr. Reed." "You sleep?" "A little. That is better than most analysts before a deadline and worse than most people with sense." He pulled up a chair. "Let's see your 3 questions." Annie handed him her notebook. Marcus read without speaking. His eyebrows rose at the second question, then again at the third. "You found the Pennsylvania duplicate last night?" "Yes, sir. I only had time to check the routing codes, but it looks like one vendor ID appears under 2 cost centers." "You're right." Annie blinked. "EM?" Marcus turned the notebook back toward her. "Don't sound surprised. It weakens the room." She sat straighter. He tapped the page. "This is where you start. Not with the full company model. Not with every warehouse from here to Ohio. Start with the duplicate route. Pull invoices for both cost centers. Compare dates. Then check whether the fuel surcharge appears twice on the same shipment window." Annie wrote quickly. Marcus watched her for a moment. "One more thing." "Yes, sir. People are going to talk today. Some will be kind because they mean it. Some will be kind because they're scared of being on the wrong side. Some will avoid you because truth makes them uncomfortable. None of that belongs in your model. Annie looked up. How do I ignore it? You don't. You acknowledge it, then you return to the work. That is different from pretending. That made sense to her. By mid-morning, Annie had pulled 6 invoices and found 3 that looked wrong. The same shipment dates appeared under 2 route codes. One set billed as third-party freight, one set billed as internal transfer. The amounts were not enormous alone, but repeated across months, they became real money. She sent Marcus a short note, possible double billing in PA vendor route, 3 sample invoices attached. His reply came 7 minutes later. Good. Build a timeline. Do not accuse yet. Let the dates speak. Annie read that twice. Let the dates speak. It sounded like something her mother would approve of. At 11:20, Brandon appeared outside her office. Annie saw him before he knocked. He looked different without the Northline folder under his arm. Younger, less certain. His shirt collar sat slightly crooked, and he kept both hands at his sides. Mrs. Parker stood from her desk. Mr. Collins. Brandon stopped. I know I'm not supposed to talk to her alone. I asked HR. Carol said I could give her this if you were present. He held out an envelope. Mrs. Parker looked at Annie. Do you want to receive it? Annie hesitated, then nodded. Brandon walked to the doorway but did not step inside. It's just a written statement. What I remember. What my dad told me. When he told me Northline had changed. Annie did not take it right away. Why give it to me? Because HR already has a copy. I wanted you to know I didn't leave it vague. Mrs. Parker took the envelope first, opened it, and scanned the first page. Then she handed it to Annie. Brandon shifted his weight. I should have asked more questions. Yes, Annie said. He nodded as if she had given him the answer he deserved. My dad always said business is about taking the opening before someone else does. I thought that was ambition. He looked down. Yesterday it looked different. Annie held the envelope. What did it look like? Like taking something from someone who earned it and calling it strategy. That was honest. Not enough to fix it, but honest. Mrs. Parker's voice cut gently into the space between them. That will be all for now, Brandon. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Before leaving, he looked at Annie again. I'm sorry. Annie did not say it was okay. It was not. I hope you mean that after it costs you something, she said. Brandon's face tightened, but he accepted it. Me too. He left. Mrs. Parker waited until he was out of earshot. You handled that well. I didn't know what to say. Sometimes that helps. People say too much when they want to sound generous. Annie placed Brandon's envelope beside the empty folder. She would read it later. Right now, she had invoices to sort. At noon, Jonathan called her into his office. His office was not what Annie expected. It was large, yes, with a view that made the city look arranged instead of crowded, but it was not showy. There were family photographs on one shelf, old industry books with cracked spines, a framed newspaper clipping from the year Whitmore Global opened its first warehouse, and a baseball signed by someone Annie did not recognize. Jonathan stood by the window. How is Northline? I found a possible duplicate billing issue in the Pennsylvania route. He turned. Already? I don't know if it's significant yet. Good answer. She sat when he gestured to the chair. He picked up a folder from his desk. Legal has begun reviewing Richard's prior assignment changes. This may become larger than your case. I thought it might. Jonathan studied her. Does that worry you? Yes, sir. It should. But worry is not always a warning to stop. Sometimes it is a reminder to move carefully. Annie nodded. He leaned back against the desk. I also want you to know something. Richard's suspension is formal now. His access is disabled. He cannot affect your standing. Thank you. You do not need to thank me for removing a threat I should have seen sooner. Annie did not know what to say to that. Jonathan looked at the file in his hand. When I started this internship program, I thought opportunity meant opening a door. Yesterday reminded me that some people stand inside the doorway and decide who gets to pass. My mother says some doors have guards pretending to be doormen. Jonathan gave a short, quiet laugh. Your mother sounds like someone I should listen to. She usually thinks so. This time he smiled, then his face settled. Keep working with Marcus. Stay factual. If anyone pressures you, tell Mrs. Parker, HR, or me. Do not handle side conversations alone. Yes, sir. And Annie? Yes? You are not here as a symbol. You are here because you earned the assignment. The words struck deeper than praise. She had been afraid people would see her now, only as the girl with the folder, the girl Richard tried to cheat, the girl the billionaire rescued. Jonathan was telling her the work still mattered. She left his office with her shoulders steadier. The afternoon passed in numbers. Annie built the invoice timeline Marcus requested. The duplicate charges spread across 6 months, not every week, not every route, but enough to suggest a system error or a vendor taking advantage of sloppy oversight. By 4, she had a clean 1-page summary. Marcus reviewed it at her desk. "This is good," he said. "How good?" "Good enough to be dangerous if you keep going." Annie smiled before she could stop herself. He pointed at the page. "Tomorrow, we test it against the Ohio route. If the pattern repeats, Northline becomes more than a student project." After he left, Annie packed up slowly. She added Brandon's statement to her bag, next to the empty folder. She had not read it yet. She would do that at home, where the floorboards creaked and her mother could tell from the way she breathed whether she needed tea or quiet. Mrs. Parker called good night as Annie passed. "Good night, ma'am." In the elevator, Annie looked at her reflection again. Yesterday, she had seen fear. Today, she saw fatigue. Yes, but also something firmer. Down in the lobby, the guard nodded. "Good night, Miss Carter." "Good night." Outside, New York was loud and crowded. But Annie no longer felt swallowed by it. She had work in her bag, evidence in her bag, and a question growing larger than the one that had started it all. If Richard had stolen her project because he feared what she could do, then what else had people like him stolen from others before anyone thought to check the folder? Annie read Brandon's statement at the kitchen table after dinner. Martha sat across from her with a mug of tea, not asking questions yet. She had learned when Annie was little that if she waited long enough, the truth usually walked out on its own. The envelope was plain white, sealed badly, as if Brandon had changed his mind once before turning it in. Annie opened it with a butter knife because her mother hated torn paper. Inside were 2 typed pages and 1 handwritten note. Annie read the typed part first. Brandon stated that his father had called him the night before assignment day and said Project Northline was being adjusted. He wrote that he had not been told Annie would receive an empty folder, but he had known she was originally under consideration for Northline. He admitted Richard told him not to ask questions because leadership requires taking the seat when it opens. Brandon also wrote that after the assignment meeting, he saw Annie question the folder and suspected something was wrong, but chose not to speak. At the bottom, he had signed his name. The handwritten note was shorter. "I should have asked where the seat came from." Annie placed the paper on the table. Martha watched her. "That help?" "I don't know." "That means yes, but not enough." Annie let out a tired breath. He knew something was wrong. Most people do. Annie looked up. Martha lifted her mug. "Not everything. Not every detail. But people know when a blessing lands in their lap smelling like somebody else's loss. They just decide whether to ask about it." Annie looked back at the note. "He says he's sorry. Maybe he is. You believe him?" "I believe sorry is a seed. It still has to grow into action." Annie folded the note and slid it back into the envelope. She did not forgive Brandon that night. She did not hate him either. She put his statement with her documents because truth was truth, even when it came late. The next morning, she arrived at Whitmore Global with both folders, Brandon's statement, and a sharper understanding of how quiet people could be around wrongdoing. Marcus was waiting in the side office with 2 coffees on the desk. "One black, one with enough cream to make it legal in 3 states, he said. "I didn't know your order, so Mrs. Parker chose." Annie looked toward Mrs. Parker's desk. Without looking up from her calendar, Mrs. Parker said, "You seemed like cream but not sugar." Annie smiled. "That's right." Marcus tapped the Northline packet. "Today we test Ohio. If Pennsylvania was an accident, the pattern should stop there. If it repeats, we've got something bigger than route cleanup." Annie opened her laptop. "I checked one Ohio vendor on the train." Marcus looked offended. "On the train?" "I was careful. That's not my concern. My concern is you're doing unpaid thinking before coffee." She took the cup. Noted. They spent the first 2 hours comparing invoice dates, shipment windows, routing codes, and surcharge categories. Marcus did not give her answers. He asked questions that made her find them. What does that date tell you? That the surcharge posted before the transfer was completed. Good. Should that happen? No. Why not? Because the fuel cost should attach to the completed route, not the estimated movement. Better. Keep going. By 10:30, Annie found the same pattern in Ohio, not as often as Pennsylvania, but enough. Duplicate charges, misclassified transfers, vendor IDs that changed by one digit depending on cost center. It looked less like a mistake and more like a system that had become useful to someone. Marcus leaned over the spreadsheet and frowned. Print this. Annie looked at him. Now? Yes. Paper slows people down, makes them read. That sounded like Martha. Annie printed the summary, 3 invoices, and a timeline. As she came back from the printer, she saw 2 interns standing near the coffee station. They stopped talking when they saw her. One of them, a white girl named Claire, stepped forward. Annie? Annie held the papers close. Yes? Claire glanced at the other intern, then lowered her voice. I'm sorry about what happened. I mean, I don't know everything, but I saw the assignment room. I should have said something. Annie did not know what to do with another apology before lunch. What would you have said? She asked. Claire's face reddened. That your folder was empty. That Mr. Collins was acting like it was your fault. The other intern, Devin, nodded. I saw him take something out before he gave it to you. I thought maybe I imagined it. Annie looked at him. Did HR ask you? Not yet. Then tell them before they do. Devin swallowed. Okay, Claire said. We didn't want to get involved. Annie's voice stayed calm. You were involved. You were in the room. Neither of them answered. She was not trying to be cruel. She was learning that truth had edges, and smoothing every edge only helped the people who cut first. When Annie returned to the side office, Marcus looked up. Everything all right? Yes. You sure? No. That is more useful. He took the printed pages. Sit. Walk me through Ohio. She did. At noon, Jonathan called a meeting in the review room. This time, Annie was not the only young person present. Claire and Devin sat near the far end of the table, stiff-backed and nervous. Brandon sat across from them, eyes low. Carol, Dana, Paul from IT, Mrs. Parker, Marcus, and Jonathan filled the rest of the room. Richard's chair remained empty. Carol began. We're gathering statements from anyone present during the assignment meeting. This is not a disciplinary interview for interns who witnessed events, but accuracy matters. Claire spoke first. Her voice shook at the start but steadied as she described the folder, Annie's question, and Richard's response. He made it sound like she was failing some test, Claire said. But none of us had that test. We all had real packets. Devin admitted he had seen Richard move papers but had doubted himself. I thought maybe managers did that kind of thing. I'm new. Jonathan looked at him. Being new is not a sin. Staying silent after you know better becomes one. Devin nodded. Brandon read part of his statement aloud. When he reached the line about taking the seat when it opened, his voice cracked. My father told me Northline would help me get in front of Mr. Whitmore, he said. I wanted that. I didn't ask enough questions because I liked the answer I had. Annie listened without looking away. It was difficult, but she owed herself the full truth. Dana asked, Did your father ever say Annie Carter should not have Northline? Brandon stared at his hands. He said she was getting too much attention. He said people like a story until the story starts thinking it deserves the office. The room went silent. Annie felt the words hit, then settle. People like a story. She knew what Richard meant. A young black woman from a modest background could be used in brochures, praised in small moments, held up as proof the company opened doors. But she was not supposed to outscore the son of the man guarding the door. Jonathan's voice was low. Did he say anything else? Brandon nodded once. He said she needed to learn where she fit. Martha's voice rose in Annie's memory. Some doors have guards pretending to be doormen. Carol closed her folder with more force than necessary. Dana wrote carefully, but her jaw was tight. Jonathan turned to Annie. Do you want a break? She shook her head. No, sir. You're sure? Yes, I want to hear it. So they continued. Paul presented the prior assignment logs. Malik Johnson, Sophia Alvarez, 2 others from past cycles. High scores. Reassigned. Poor final evaluations after being moved into low visibility work. Richard's notes appeared beside each file, written in the same language: fit, polish, presence, client comfort. Marcus sat back, arms crossed. That's not evaluation, that's sorting, Carol nodded, and not the kind this program was built to do. Jonathan looked at the names on the screen for a long time. Contact them, Dana said. We should proceed through counsel. Then proceed through counsel, but contact them. The meeting paused when Mrs. Parker brought in printed copies of the current findings. She placed one in front of Jonathan, one in front of Dana, and one in front of Carol. Then she handed Annie her Northline invoice summary, printed cleanly with the duplicate charges highlighted. Marcus nodded toward it. We also have a project issue. Dana looked up. Related to the investigation? No, Marcus said. Related to the fact that Annie is already doing the work Richard said she could not handle. Annie felt every eye move toward her. Marcus slid the summary forward. She identified a possible duplicate billing pattern in Pennsylvania and Ohio routing. It may be a vendor error or internal coding failure. Too early to accuse. Not too early to examine. Jonathan read the first page. His eyes moved line by line. When he reached the totals, he looked up. You found this yesterday? Last night and this morning, Annie said. Marcus added, with proper review, this could become the backbone of a serious Northline proposal. Brandon looked at the summary, then at Annie. For the first time, there was no envy in his face, only recognition. Jonathan placed the pages down carefully. Let the record show, he said, that the intern given an empty folder has already found what an entire department missed. Annie looked at the table. She did not want to smile, but something in her chest loosened. Carol's voice softened. Good work, Miss Carter. Thank you, ma'am. The meeting ended with assignments. Legal would continue the misconduct review. HR would contact prior interns. IT would preserve records. Marcus would supervise Northline. Annie would keep working. As they left, Brandon waited near the door. Annie, he said. She stopped. I meant what I wrote. She looked at him. Then keep meaning it when your father asks you to change your story. His face went pale. I won't, he said. Annie hoped that was true. But hope, she had learned, was not a record. Action was. Back at her side office, she placed the new invoice summary beside the empty folder. One proved what Richard had done. The other proved what he had tried to prevent. Mrs. Parker passed by and glanced in. You all right? Annie looked at the papers spread across the desk. No, ma'am, she said, but I'm working. Mrs. Parker nodded. That will do for today. Annie turned back to the data. Outside her small office, the company kept moving, but something inside it had shifted. The empty folder was no longer the center of the story. It was the door. And behind that door, more names were waiting to be remembered. By the end of the day, Annie had learned the shape of the duplicate billing pattern, but not yet its cause. The Pennsylvania and Ohio routes showed the same irregularity. 2 cost centers, 2 vendor codes, 1 shipment window. Sometimes the amounts were small enough to hide inside a monthly report. Sometimes they were large enough to make her stop and check the formula twice. Marcus returned to her side office at 4:15 with his sleeves rolled and a pencil behind one ear. You still on the Ohio file? He asked. Yes, sir. The pattern repeats in 3 months, then disappears, then comes back. That usually means one of 2 things. System error or someone learned when to stop before it became obvious. He looked pleased despite himself. You're getting less polite with Data. Data doesn't mind. No, it does not. He pulled a chair close and scanned the spreadsheet. Show me February. Annie clicked to the tab. Here. Same transfer window, different billing route. The vendor ID changes from 41B to 41D, but the shipment reference is almost identical. Only the last 2 digits are different. Marcus leaned closer. That's not common. I searched the data dictionary. The last 2 digits should identify separate shipment batches, but the delivery dates and warehouse scans match. Print the scan records. She did. The printer down the hall warmed up and began to hum. While they waited, Marcus looked toward the empty folder on her desk. You know people are talking about that. Annie did not look up. I figured. Some of them are saying Richard was always hard on interns. Some are saying nobody knew. Some are saying they knew but thought it was just his style. His style almost got me removed. Yes, Marcus said. That is why calling cruelty a style is dangerous. Annie turned from the screen. Marcus kept his voice level. I worked under a man like Richard when I was younger. Different decade, different haircut, same disease. He could take credit from 3 people before lunch and still call himself a mentor. What happened to him? He retired with a plaque. Annie's face fell. Marcus nodded. I wish I had a better ending for that one. But that is why you keep records. Sometimes justice arrives late. Sometimes it only arrives because somebody younger refuses to inherit the silence. The printer beeped. Annie stood, but Marcus lifted a hand. I'll get them. You keep looking at March. When he left, Annie sat still for a second. She had expected older people to offer neat comfort. The kind that said, everything worked out if you did right. But the people she trusted most did not talk that way. Her mother, Mrs. Parker, Marcus, even Jonathan, they told the truth with the lights on. Her phone buzzed with a message from Martha. Do not stay too late. Work will take all the hours you hand it. Annie typed back. I know, I'm leaving soon. Martha replied. Soon is not a time. Annie smiled and typed, 6. A thumbs up appeared. Marcus returned with the scan records, and his expression had changed. What? Annie asked. He set the pages beside her keyboard. The warehouse scans match. So it is the same shipment. Looks that way. Annie looked at the highlighted lines. Then the company paid twice? Possibly. We need more than 3 examples before we say that. How many? Enough to make denial uncomfortable. She opened a new sheet and began building a table. Shipment date. Region. Vendor ID. Route code. Cost center. Duplicate flag. Invoice amount. Evidence link. Marcus watched her set the columns. Good structure, he said. Clean. Anyone can follow it. That matters? It matters more than sounding smart. A clear table can walk into a room after you and still defend itself. At 5:30, Dana came to the door. Do you have a moment? Annie looked at Marcus. He nodded and stood. I'll send you the template I use for audit notes. Don't stay past 6. Dana waited until he left. We contacted Malik Johnson. Annie's hand stopped on the mouse. He agreed to speak tomorrow, Dana continued. He was cautious at first. Then we mentioned that assignment records were under review. Did he say anything? Only one thing, he said. I wondered how long it would take someone to find the folder. Annie felt the room tighten. The folder? She asked. Dana nodded. We don't know what he means yet. Was his folder empty too? We'll find out. Annie looked at the empty folder on her desk. Suddenly it seemed less like a single object and more like a method. Dana's voice softened. I'm telling you, because your statement opened this review. But I also want to be clear. You are not responsible for carrying everyone else's case. I know. Dana gave her a look that said she was not sure Annie did. Miss Carter, responsibility has a way of flattering good people into exhaustion. Annie almost smiled. My mother would like you. I'm a lawyer. Mothers are divided on us. That earned a small laugh. Dana placed a card on the desk. This is my direct number. If anyone calls, texts, approaches you, or asks you to soften your statement, tell me. Has someone done that? Not yet, but you think they might. I think Richard Collins knows where the pressure points are. Annie thought of Brandon's statement, of Claire and Devon, of the prior names in the system. What about Brandon? He confirmed his written statement in front of HR. He also turned over 2 texts from Richard. Annie did not ask what they said. Dana told her anyway. One says, do not discuss Northline with Annie. Another says, let Friday handle her. Annie's stomach turned. Let Friday handle her. That was the plan in 4 words. Not confrontation, not debate. Just wait until the deadline crushed her and call the result professional. Dana watched her carefully. Do you need a minute? No, I needed to hear it. At 6, Annie packed her bag. She placed the Northline packet inside, then her notes, then the empty folder. She paused over the audit table on her screen before saving it under a clear file name. Northline, duplicate, root, review, AC. Mrs. Parker was putting on her coat when Annie stepped out. "Leaving on time," Mrs. Parker said. "A miracle on the 47th floor. My mother negotiated it. Then I thank her." They walked together toward the elevators. The office had thinned, leaving behind the low hum of machines and the smell of reheated coffee. Near the far corridor, the door to Richard's office was closed. A security seal had been placed across the frame. Annie had seen seals like that on television, never in a place where she worked. She slowed without meaning to. Mrs. Parker noticed. "It feels strange, doesn't it?" "Yes, ma'am." He made that office feel bigger than it was. Annie looked at the sealed door. "I was scared of going in there yesterday." That was the point. The elevator arrived. Inside, Mrs. Parker pressed the lobby button. For several floors, neither of them spoke. Then Annie asked, "Did you ever see him do something like this before?" Mrs. Parker looked straight ahead. "I saw pieces." Annie waited, an intern leaving early without explanation. A project reassigned at the last minute. Richard saying someone wasn't ready. At the time, each piece looked small. She turned to Annie. "That is not an excuse. It is a confession." Annie did not know what to say. Mrs. Parker continued, "The older I get, the less I trust small cruelties. They are usually rehearsals." The elevator doors opened into the lobby. Mrs. Parker touched Annie's shoulder lightly, only for a second. "Go home, eat, sleep, come back with your questions." "Yes, ma'am." On the train home, Annie read through the printed scan records until the motion made her eyes tired. Across from her, a little boy slept against his grandmother's coat, while the grandmother kept one hand protectively over his backpack. Annie thought about how much of love was guarding things for someone too young or too tired to guard them alone. At home, Martha had made tomato soup and grilled cheese, the meal she cooked when money was tight or the day had been too much. Annie set her folders on the kitchen table and washed her hands. Martha glanced at the empty folder. More happened. "How can you tell? You set that folder down like it spoke again." Annie sat and told her about Malik Johnson, the hidden notes, the texts from Richard, and the duplicate billing she had found. Martha listened, breaking one grilled cheese sandwich in half and sliding the larger piece to Annie. When Annie finished, Martha said, "That man didn't just steal a project. He trusted the world to help him hide it." Annie dipped the sandwich into the soup. "Do you think it will really change anything?" Martha leaned back. Her face looked tired, but her eyes stayed clear. "I think change is like cleaning a burned pot. First pass doesn't make it shine, but somebody has to start scraping." Annie laughed softly. "That is the most Martha Carter thing you've ever said." "It is also true." After dinner, Annie allowed herself only 30 minutes on North Line. She added 2 Ohio records to the duplicate table, wrote a note for Marcus, then shut the laptop before her mother could remind her. Before bed, she opened the empty folder again. The date she had written in the corner was still there. She added nothing else. Not yet. She placed it beside the Northline packet on the chair near her bed. In the dark, the 2 folders became shapes more than objects. One was the insult. One was the assignment. Somewhere between them was the reason she would return. The next morning would bring Malik Johnson's story, more records, and maybe more pain. But it would also bring work. And work, Annie was beginning to understand, could be more than a task. In the right hands, it could become a way to answer back. The lesson of Annie's story is that injustice often hides behind polite words, official titles, and quiet paperwork. But truth leaves traces, and courage begins when someone refuses to accept silence as an answer. Annie teaches us that dignity does not mean staying quiet when something is wrong. It means standing firm, keeping the evidence, and letting the truth speak clearly. The story reminds us that real fairness is not a favor given by the powerful. It is a responsibility everyone must protect, especially when the person being mistreated is young, alone, or easy to ignore. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.